My husband's boss was playing recordings of my phone calls. The voice was identical to mine, but I never said those words. My mother confessed, "He's taking you away from the family. If he loses his job, you'll move back home with us." The whole thing started 3 months ago when my husband came home looking completely defeated. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands and told me his supervisor had called him into the office again. Apparently, I'd been calling his workplace multiple times a week, screaming at whoever answered the phone about poor customer service and demanding they fire the rude employee who'd helped me. The problem was, I'd never called his workplace. Not once. At first, we thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe someone with a similar voice had been calling and giving my name. My husband works for a mid-sized company that deals with public inquiries, so wrong numbers and confused customers aren't unusual. But the calls kept coming, and each time, the person on the phone knew specific details about my husband's schedule, his department, and even mentioned our address. The breaking point came when his boss called him in for what felt like the 10th time that month. This time, though, she had recordings. Company policy required them to record all incoming calls for quality assurance, and she'd saved several of the worst ones. She hit play, and my own voice filled the room, dripping with venom as it berated some poor receptionist and demanded immediate action against my husband. I sat there in complete shock listening to myself say things I'd never even thought, let alone spoken out loud. The voice inflection, the way I pronounced certain words, even the slight accent I'd picked up from living in 3 different states growing up, it was all there. But the words were wrong, the anger was wrong, everything was wrong. My husband's boss looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. She explained that while she understood this was clearly a personal matter, the company couldn't ignore repeated harassment calls, especially ones targeting specific employees. She gave him 2 weeks to resolve whatever was happening at home, or they'd have to start looking at more serious consequences. The drive home was silent. My husband kept glancing at me like he was seeing a stranger, and honestly, I felt like one too. How do you prove you didn't do something when there's literal audio evidence of you doing it? How do you convince someone that the voice that sounds exactly like yours isn't actually yours? That night, I called my mother. We'd been having some tension lately about how often I visited, how much time I spent with my husband versus my family, the usual guilt trips that had been ramping up since we got married 2 years ago. But this felt different. As soon as I started explaining what had happened, there was this long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, she asked me to describe exactly what the voice on the recording had said. I repeated some of the phrases, and I could hear her breathing change. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said it, "He's taking you away from the family. If he loses his job, you'll move back home with us." The confession came pouring out after that. She'd been practicing my voice for months, recording our phone conversations and playing them back, studying the way I spoke until she could mimic me perfectly. She'd started calling his workplace using different reasons, sometimes pretending to be a dissatisfied customer, sometimes claiming to be me personally complaining about my husband's behavior at home. She'd done her homework too. She'd looked up his company online, found out who his supervisors were, even figured out his direct line by calling the main number and sweet-talking the receptionist. She knew his schedule because I'd mentioned it in passing during family dinners. She knew our address because she'd helped us move in. The worst part was realizing how calculated it all was. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment, emotional outburst. She'd been planning this for months, carefully building a case against my husband piece by piece. Every time I'd mentioned that he was doing well at work, or that we were thinking about buying a house, or planning a vacation, she'd been filing that information away for later use. Update 1. I confronted my mother the next day, driving over to her house before I could lose my nerve. She was in her garden, pruning roses like nothing had happened, and when she saw me coming up the walkway, she actually smiled and waved. It was so normal, so ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the whole conversation. But when I brought up the phone calls, her entire demeanor changed. The mask just dropped, and suddenly I was looking at someone I barely recognized. She didn't deny it anymore. Instead, she doubled down. She started listing all the ways my husband had supposedly ruined our family dynamics, how I never called anymore, how I'd missed 3 family gatherings in the past year, how I used to tell her everything and now I barely shared basic updates about my life. According to her twisted logic, my husband was the root of all these problems. If he wasn't in the picture, things would go back to the way they used to be. She genuinely believed that destroying his career was justified if it meant getting her daughter back. The scariest part was how rational she sounded while explaining completely irrational behavior. She'd convinced herself that she was the victim in this situation, that my husband had somehow brainwashed me into choosing him over my family. She kept saying things like, "I raised you better than this," and "family should always come first." I tried to explain that marriage meant creating a new family unit, that it was natural for me to prioritize my husband and our life together. But she wasn't hearing any of it. In her mind, I'd been manipulated, and she was just trying to save me from myself. When I told her she had to stop calling his workplace immediately, she refused. She said she'd put too much work into this plan to give up now, and besides, she was just getting started. That's when I realized this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation and an apology. I spent the rest of that week gathering evidence. I started recording our phone calls, documenting the times she'd ask suspicious questions about my husband's work schedule or his boss's name. I went through old text messages and found dozens of instances where she'd been fishing for information that could be used against him. The hardest part was accepting that my own mother was actively trying to destroy my marriage. Growing up, she'd always been protective, maybe a little too involved in my decisions, but I'd chalked it up to her caring about me. Now I was seeing that her version of caring had crossed into something much darker. I also had to face the fact that this probably wasn't going to be fixable with a heart-to-heart conversation or family therapy. This was someone who'd spent months planning and executing a scheme to ruin my husband's livelihood. The level of premeditation and manipulation involved wasn't something that could be reasoned away. My husband, meanwhile, was falling apart. The stress of potentially losing his job, combined with the realization that his mother-in-law was actively sabotaging him, was taking a toll on his health. He wasn't sleeping, he'd lost his appetite, and he was jumping every time his work phone rang. His performance was actually starting to suffer because he was so anxious about the next call coming in. Update 2. Things escalated quickly after my confrontation with my mother. Instead of backing down, she ramped up her campaign. The calls to my husband's workplace became more frequent and more vicious. She'd expanded her targets too, calling not just his direct supervisor, but also HR, the company's customer service line, and even the corporate headquarters. She'd also gotten more creative with her complaints. Instead of just pretending to be an angry customer, she started calling as me, claiming to be a concerned wife reporting my husband for drinking on the job, showing up late, being inappropriate with female coworkers. Each lie was designed to hit a different pressure point that could lead to immediate termination. The breaking point came when she called pretending to be me and reported that my husband had made inappropriate comments about the company's female clients. This wasn't just about customer service anymore. This was a sexual harassment allegation that could destroy his career permanently, even if it was eventually proven false. His boss called him in that same day. She looked exhausted and frustrated as she explained that they now had multiple serious allegations on file, all apparently coming from his wife. The company was launching a formal investigation, and he was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. That's when I knew I had to take drastic action. I couldn't let my mother destroy an innocent person's life just because she couldn't accept that I'd grown up and gotten married. I gathered all the evidence I'd been collecting, the recorded phone calls where she admitted to impersonating me, the text messages where she'd been fishing for information, everything. I drove straight to my husband's workplace and asked to speak with his boss immediately. I brought my phone, my laptop, and a folder full of printed screenshots and call logs. I sat across from this woman who'd been dealing with weeks of harassment calls and played her the recording of my mother confessing to the whole scheme. The relief on her face was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She realized that not only had they been dealing with a fraudulent harassment campaign, but they'd been putting an innocent employee through hell because of it. She asked me why I hadn't come forward sooner, and honestly, I didn't have a good answer. Part of me had hoped I could handle it privately, keep it within the family, avoid this exact moment of having to expose my mother's behavior to strangers. But the other part of me, the part I'm not proud of, had been in denial about how far she was willing to go. Even after she confessed, even after she refused to stop, some small piece of me kept thinking she'd come to her senses and end this on her own. The company decided to pursue legal action. Not just a restraining order, but actual criminal charges for harassment, impersonation, and making false reports. They documented every call, every complaint, every hour of staff time that had been wasted dealing with my mother's fake allegations. The financial impact alone was significant enough to justify pressing charges, never mind the emotional toll on my husband and his co-workers. I had to make a choice: support the legal case against my mother, or try to protect her and potentially lose my husband in the process. It wasn't really a choice at all. I gave them copies of all my evidence and agreed to testify if necessary. My extended family found out when the police showed up at my mother's house with a warrant. Suddenly, I was getting calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd heard some version of the story and wanted to know what was really going on. My mother had apparently told them that my husband was abusive and controlling, and that she'd been trying to help me escape a dangerous situation. Some of them believed her version. Others seemed to understand that something wasn't right about her story, especially when I played them the recordings of her confessing to the impersonation scheme. But even the ones who supported me seemed baffled by the situation. Nobody could quite wrap their heads around a mother going to such elaborate lengths to sabotage her daughter's marriage. The worst part was realizing that this probably wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. Looking back, I started remembering other relationships that had ended badly, friendships that had fallen apart for mysterious reasons, job opportunities that had somehow fallen through at the last minute. I began to wonder how many times my mother had interfered in my life without me knowing it. Final update. The legal case moved forward quickly once the company's lawyers got involved. My mother's phone records showed dozens of calls to my husband's workplace over a 3-month period, all coming from her personal cell phone, but with caller ID spoofing to make it look like they were coming from various numbers. She'd even signed up for multiple phone services to make the deception more convincing. The most damning evidence came from her own digital footprint. She'd researched voice mimicking techniques online, watched YouTube tutorials about changing your speech patterns, and even looked into professional voice coaching services. Her browser history showed months of preparation, including searches for my husband's company policies, employee handbook information, and legal loopholes related to workplace harassment claims. When faced with overwhelming evidence, she finally hired a lawyer who advised her to accept a plea deal. She pled guilty to criminal harassment and making false reports, receiving probation and a significant fine. The restraining order prevents her from contacting my husband's workplace or coming within 500 feet of either of us. But the legal resolution was almost secondary to the personal reckoning I had to face. This wasn't just about my mother making some phone calls. This was about years of manipulation and control that I'd somehow normalized. Looking back, I could see the pattern clearly now. Every relationship, every job, every major life decision had been influenced by her need to keep me dependent and close. She'd raised me to believe that family loyalty meant putting her needs above my own, that questioning her judgment was a betrayal, that any relationship that took attention away from her was inherently threatening. I'd been so conditioned to manage her emotions and accommodate her demands that I'd never really learned to set healthy boundaries. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't fix this. I kept thinking there had to be some combination of words, some perfect explanation that would make her understand why her behavior was wrong and harmful. But you can't reason with someone who fundamentally believes that their feelings justify any action, no matter how destructive. My husband was incredibly patient through all of this, but I could see the toll it was taking on him too. He'd married me, not my family drama, and suddenly he was dealing with criminal harassment, job insecurity, and a wife who was having to completely reevaluate her relationship with her mother. That's not what anyone signs up for when they say I do. We ended up moving to a different state, partly for his career opportunities, but mostly to put physical distance between us and my mother. It felt like running away, but sometimes running away is the healthiest choice you can make. We needed space to build our own life without the constant threat of interference and manipulation. The move was harder than I expected. I'd lived my entire life within a 2-hour drive of my childhood home, and suddenly I was in a place where nobody knew my history or my family. But it was also liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions without worrying about how they'd affect my mother's mood or trigger her next scheme. I had to grieve the mother I thought I had, the relationship I thought we'd shared. It's a strange kind of loss when someone is still alive, but you realize they were never really who you believed them to be. All those memories of feeling loved and protected were now tainted by the understanding that her love came with strings attached, that her protection was really just another form of control. Some days I miss her terribly. Not the person who tried to destroy my marriage, but the person I thought she was before I understood what she was really capable of. I miss having a mother I could call with good news, someone who would be genuinely happy for my successes instead of seeing them as threats to her influence over my life. Other days I feel nothing but relief. Relief that I don't have to manage her emotions anymore, that I don't have to filter every piece of information about my life through the lens of how it might affect her. That my husband can go to work without wondering if today will be the day his career gets destroyed by someone who's supposed to love me. We're building something new now, my husband and I. A life that belongs to us, decisions that reflect our values instead of my mother's fears, a future that we get to define for ourselves. It's scary sometimes, operating without the familiar weight of her expectations and demands, but it's also incredibly freeing. I still get emails from extended family members asking when I'm going to forgive her, when we're going to work things out, reminding me that she's getting older and family is important. They don't understand that forgiveness doesn't mean subjecting yourself to continued harm, that family relationships have to be earned and maintained through respect and healthy behavior. My mother continues to tell anyone who will listen that she was just trying to protect me, that my husband manipulated me into cutting off my family, that she's the real victim in this situation. Part of me will always feel guilty for not being able to save her from her own destructive patterns, but I've learned that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. What I can do is protect the life I've built, nurture the relationships that are based on mutual respect and genuine love, and break the cycle of manipulation that probably goes back generations in my family. It's not the ending I would have chosen, but it's the ending that allows me to have a healthy marriage and a chance at real happiness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behaviors, even if they never understand or appreciate that choice. Sometimes choosing your own well-being isn't selfish, it's necessary. And sometimes the family you create is more important than the family you were born into, even when that truth breaks your heart.